Hi there. I haven't done a podcast for a couple of weeks. My mother passed a couple of weeks ago, and I suppose around the time that I suppose all of that happened and the funeral and everything else, um, yeah, I guess my heart really wasn't in it, and it hasn't been. Um, but today, I guess I'm back, and I think this particular episode is very much influenced by the last 2 weeks because it's about grief or a little bit about grief, but it's not going to be a downer episode. I think what I've been reflecting on is um, some of the benefits that this process, this time, has kind of maybe weirdly brought. And I think one of the things that, obviously with grief, there's sadness, there's upset, there's, all those different types of emotions, very unique experience. But then also there's quiet. And something that surprised me over the last couple of weeks was, from my point of view, I would think I'm relatively present. I think compared to many people, because of my job, because of my interest, I probably live with less mental noise than the average person because of the work that I do. And I guess also the work that I've done on myself over the last 30 years. But when grief arrived for me, everything slowed down even more. And I realized that there's still far more background mental movement in my system than I understood. Just very, very subtle things like thinking about the future, planning, optimization, be a low level urgency, psychological momentum on certain things. But during those few days with my family, I saw something different because there was nowhere else to be. There was no productivity game. There was no rocks. If you know me long enough, you know what that was about. Well, there was kind of one major rock, but that was, it was planted firmly in my lap. But there was no performance. There was no rushing. There was just conversations and there was tea, a lot of tea. Yeah, maybe too much tea. There was lots of sandwiches, way more sandwiches than I'd ever normally eat. But also with that, there was silence. There were stories and there was presence. And honestly, at various times over the time, particularly around the time of mom's passing, in a weird way, I was probably more present than I've been in a long, long time at this kind of weird, really rich presence. And I think maybe that's the key point that I want to point to in this particular episode is that, most people think that maybe mental noise only exists when they're obviously stressed. But I think a lot of noise is very, very subtle. And it's just that little constant internal movement towards the next thing, the next task, the next conversation, the next meeting, the next future scenario. And because modern life rewards speed, responsiveness, and maybe stimulation, that kind of internal movement starts to feel normal. And I think even if you're relatively self-aware, that's still the case. And for me, what grief did, at least temporarily, was to interrupt that subtle noise in the background. It slowed everything down enough for me to notice how much energy subtle mental movement consumes, or how much presence gets lost inside thinking about the future, or how naturally clarity appears when your mind really quietens. And what also surprised me was that as my mind became quieter, I actually got even more clarity. I was just really clear that, in a way that in other areas of my life, when just ideas would come in, ideas for my life, ideas for my business, and I was noting things down about, oh, that's going to work over here. And also got perspective on what really, really mattered, something that I think you would expect from um, the death and passing of a loved one. But I think what I was seeing was something that completely contradicts the modern assumption that constant mental activity equals effectiveness. And sometimes the opposite is true. Very often clarity really appears when your noise falls away. Now, most people in my experience live with a low level psychological movement inside all day without even noticing it. So you could be having dinner with your family, you could be walking outside, you could be sitting with somebody you care about, you could be listening to your child speak, but part of your mind very often can be elsewhere. It could be planning, thinking ahead, problem solving, rehearsing, replaying, optimizing. Again, it can be very, very subtle. And because it's subtle, I think we assume, oh, it's just normal. But what if much of what we call normal is really interference? It's that background mental noise that's robbing us of that clarity. Now, one of the things that really struck me during that time around my mother's passing was how different the quality of attention became. I think normally, even when we're physically with people, part of the mind is often somewhere else. Who knows? Maybe it's on the future, maybe it's on something that the person said or you think they're going to say, maybe it's something to do with something that happened an hour ago. But during those days with my family, not all the time, but a good chunk of the time, that movement inside me just stopped. There was nowhere else to be. And I noticed simple things much more deeply. In particular, conversations that were so rich. Humor, even in that situation, it was there everywhere. Silence, stories, cups of tea, sitting down having cups of tea with people, and just as simple as it sounds, just sitting with somebody, sitting with people. I mean, it just sounds small, but the quality of presence in those moments felt completely different to me. And what I realized was, the more the mind was quietening down, life actually felt richer, a lot richer. Not because the circumstances were easy, because they weren't. But I guess because my attention was no longer scattered across different places. And somewhere inside of all that, I found myself appreciating more deeply how much of who we are has quietly been shaped as well by other people. Now, I was trying to find a kind of a metaphor and analogy that might link with this, but I think maybe it's a bit like living beside a motorway. If you live beside a motorway long enough, eventually you stop kind of hearing the traffic. It becomes background noise. But then you go somewhere completely quiet. Maybe it's a cabin or the countryside or a still morning with no sound. And only then do you realize, oh, background noise actually is quite loud. This is what silence is really like. And the last couple of weeks for me, not all the time, but a good chunk of the time, that's what it felt like. And my mind, as I said, wasn't chaotic before, but grief showed me a level of stillness, of inner calm, and another layer of quiet underneath that gentle hum of noise. So let's bring it back to you. Where maybe in your life are you physically present, but mentally you're somewhere else? It could be with somebody close to you. It could be somebody in your personal life. It could be somebody in your work life. It could be a project. It could be something to do with cash flow. It could be something to do with, well, I don't know. You tell me. Like, where in your life might you be there, but mentally you're not there. You're somewhere else. Or there's some sort of noise or distraction or interference. A second question. What forms of subtle inner noise have you started treating as normal? Are you really present where you want to be? Work, personal life, family. Third question. If your mind, if it became even 20, 25% quieter, what difference would that make to you, do you think? Do you think you get more insights, more ideas, more solutions, more money-making ideas? In my experience, you do. So the question then is, okay, well, how do I do that? Or do I even prioritize it? So I think maybe a kind of a takeaway, if I was to summarize it all into maybe one or two lines, I'd say, well, sometimes maybe it's only when life slows us down, it forces us to slow down with something like the passing of a loved one or something that's painful. Maybe it's only then that we realize how much unnecessary mental noise we were living inside. And maybe strangely, when that noise quietens, clarity just appears by default on its own. And again, to close out, I think what surprised me most wasn't just the grief, which in its own way is quite unique and quite surprising. But what also surprised me was maybe the gift of extra quietness. That's it for this week. Ciao for now.